Stacy Brooks had exactly $400 to her name when her stepmother sold her like furniture at auction. No goodbye, no apology, just a paddle raised in a room full of strangers who looked at her like meat on a hook. She thought the highest bidder would be her end. A trafficker, a predator, someone who would make her disappear into the dark underbelly of Los Angeles and never be heard from again. She was wrong. Hae-un Choi hadn't bought me because he wanted me. He bought me because someone had made a mistake, and before sunrise, people were going to die because of it.
Welcome to Juna AfroKorean Stories, where love is never simple, power is never given, and the women at the center of these stories always find a way to rise. If this is your first time here, you're exactly where you're supposed to be. Stay close. This story is going to take you somewhere you won't want to live.
The morning my father died, I was making him coffee. 2 sugars, splash of cream, the way he'd taken it every day since I was old enough to reach the counter. I heard the thud from the living room before I heard anything else. No warning, no goodbye, just a sound that ended everything I thought my life was going to be. Marcus Brooks collapsed at 53 years old. A massive stroke that took him before the paramedics even made it through the door. I was 25. I became an orphan in the time it took coffee to go cold. I didn't know it then, but the man who raised me, who built a trucking company from a single rig into a fleet of 40 trucks, who taught me how to read a balance sheet before I could drive, had left behind more than grief. He'd left behind a company drowning in debt no one had bothered to mention to me, and a stepmother who saw an opportunity instead of a tragedy. Sloane Whitlock had been my father's wife for 6 years. I never called her Mom. I never wanted to. She had a talent for smiling at funerals and calculating inheritances in the same breath. Within 3 months of burying my father, she'd sold the company, drained what was left of his savings, and informed me we were starting fresh in Los Angeles. She said it like a gift. It wasn't. It was a leash, and I didn't realize I was wearing one until it was already too tight to slip off. Atlanta had been home. Los Angeles was a cage with better weather. We landed in a cramped apartment in a part of the city where the rent ate everything and the walls were thin enough to hear every argument from the unit next door. Sloane didn't work. She'd never worked a day in her life that I could remember, and grief hadn't changed that. What grief did was give her an excuse. For the spa days, the designer bags, the long weekends at private card tables where the lighting was always dim and the men were always watching, I worked. God, I worked. Mornings at a diner off Sunset, slinging eggs and refilling coffee for tourists who tipped in spare change. Afternoons cleaning houses for families who had more bathrooms than I had hours in a day. I came home with my feet bleeding through my socks and my back screaming, and Sloane would be waiting at the kitchen table with her hand already out. "You owe me," she'd say, like I was the one who'd taken something from her. "I raised you. I gave you a roof. You think roofs are free?" I gave her everything, every paycheck, every tip. She took it the way some people take air, like it was owed to her, like my exhaustion was simply the cost of her comfort. When I tried to keep a little aside, even $20 hidden in a shoe for emergencies, she found it. She always found it. The isolation came slow. Then all at once, friends from the diner stopped texting back after Sloane told them I'd been talking about them behind their backs. Lies, all of it, but lies dressed up convincingly enough that I lost 3 friendships in a single month and never understood why until much later. A man I'd been seeing, a quiet mechanic named Dale who used to bring me coffee at the end of my shift, disappeared after Sloane called him and told him things about me that weren't true. I asked her why. She just shrugged. "You don't need distractions, Stacy. You need to focus on this family." This family. As if a family was something you could bleed dry and still call by that name. What I didn't see, what I couldn't have seen, was the other side of Sloane's life, the one she kept locked away from the apartment and the diner and the exhausted version of me. She'd found her way into private card rooms scattered across the city. Rooms run by men who didn't advertise and didn't forgive. At first it was a few $100s lost on a bad night, then a few thousand. By the time I noticed anything was wrong, Sloane owed close to $80,000 to people who did not send polite reminder letters. The phone started ringing at strange hours, numbers I didn't recognize, voices that asked for Sloane in flat, unbothered tones that made the hair on my arms rise. She'd take the calls in the bathroom with the fan running, but the apartment walls were thin, and I caught fragments. 48 hours. Final notice. You knew the terms. She stopped sleeping. She started flinching at knocks on the door. The woman who'd spent 6 years treating me like an inconvenience was suddenly watching me with an expression I couldn't place. Calculating. Almost relieved, like she'd found the answer to a problem she hadn't told me she had. "There's an event Friday night," she said one evening, not looking up from her phone. Her voice was too casual, the kind of casual people use when they're hiding something underneath it. "A private gathering downtown. I need you to come with me. Wear something nice." I should have asked more questions. I should have noticed the way her hands trembled around her wine glass, the way she avoided my eyes when she said gathering instead of telling me what it actually was. I thought it was just another one of her parties, another night of standing in a corner while Sloane networked with people who made my skin crawl. I had no idea I was about to find out exactly what $80,000 in debt was worth to the woman who raised me. The building didn't look like anything from the outside, a converted warehouse in the industrial stretch near the Los Angeles docks, unmarked, the kind of place you'd drive past 100 times without a second glance. Sloane had me wear a dark green dress she'd picked out herself, the kind of thing that made me feel like I was being dressed up for someone else's purpose rather than my own evening. I should have read the signs. I didn't want to. Inside, the warehouse had been transformed. Heavy curtains hung along the walls, chandeliers retrofitted into the exposed beams above, and rows of velvet chairs arranged in front of a raised platform like something out of an old auction house. Men in tailored suits sat with drinks in hand, speaking in low voices, occasionally glancing toward the front of the room with the kind of interest that made my stomach twist before my mind caught up to what I was looking at. "Sloane," I whispered, gripping her arm. "What is this?" She didn't answer. She wouldn't look at me. A man near the door checked names off a list, murmured something to another man holding a clipboard, and within minutes I understood that I wasn't a guest at this event. I was the event. Sloane had brought me here as currency, the same way she'd have written a check if she'd had the money to cover it. $80,000, and I was the closest thing to liquid assets she had left. I don't remember screaming, though I'm told later I did. I remember the cold press of a hand against my back, guiding me, shoving me toward the platform. I remember the lights, too bright, washing out the faces in the crowd until they were nothing but shapes and the glint of raised paddles. I remember the auctioneer's voice, smooth and practiced, listing numbers like he was selling livestock instead of a person. 40,000. 50. The bids rose like a fever, and with every number I felt myself disappearing a little further, becoming less of a woman and more of a sum. And then the room went quiet. A man near the back had raised his paddle without a word, without even looking up from his phone, and the auctioneer's voice cracked slightly as he announced the number. A figure so far beyond anything else bid that night that the entire room seemed to hold its breath at once. I didn't understand the silence until I followed the eyes of everyone around me toward the man who'd made it happen. He was younger than I expected, late 30s maybe, with dark hair combed back and a face carved from something colder than stone. He wore a black suit with no tie, sleeves giving way to forearms inked with patterns I didn't recognize, and a watch that probably cost more than every truck my father had ever owned. He didn't look at me with hunger. He didn't look at me at all, not directly. He looked through the room like he was already bored with everyone in it. The whispers started immediately, hushed and frightened, rippling backward through the crowd like a current. Hae-un Choi. I didn't know the name yet, but I understood from the way grown men in expensive suits suddenly found their drinks fascinating that I should be afraid. Someone near me murmured something about shipping routes and disappearances, about men who crossed him and were never spoken of again. The auctioneer practically tripped over himself, finalizing the sale, and within minutes I was being escorted off the platform by a man easily twice my size, my legs barely cooperating beneath me. I expected violence. I expected to be thrown into the back of a car and driven somewhere I'd never be found. Instead, Hae-un Choi simply nodded toward a black SUV waiting outside, said something low to the man beside him, and walked toward the vehicle without sparing me a second glance. I followed because I didn't know what else to do. Running wasn't an option. I had nowhere to run to, and Sloane had already vanished back into the crowd, her deck cleared, her stepdaughter forgotten the moment the gavel fell. The drive was silent. I sat rigid in the back seat, waiting for the moment the mask would slip, waiting for the monster the whispers had promised me. It never came. He didn't touch me. He didn't speak to me beyond a single instruction. Seatbelt. Delivered in a voice that was quiet, almost bored, like he had far more pressing things on his mind than the woman he'd just bought for an obscene amount of money. The estate, when we arrived, looked nothing like the prison I'd braced myself for. Set high above the California coastline, all glass and clean lines and quiet, expensive silence, it looked more like the kind of place you'd see in a magazine than anywhere a monster would keep his victims. Staff met us at the door, not guards with weapons drawn, but a woman who introduced herself simply as Mrs. Park and showed me to a private room with its own bathroom, a closet already stocked with clothes in my size, and a bed so soft I nearly cried at the sight of it. "Mr. Choi asks that you rest," Mrs. Park said, folding her hands in front of her. "Dinner will be ready if you're hungry. No one will disturb you tonight." I sat on the edge of that bed for a long time after she left, waiting for the catch, waiting for the moment the kindness revealed itself as something crueler underneath. It never came. I ate. I showered until the smell of the auction house was gone from my skin. I slept, for the first time in years, without flinching at every sound in the apartment walls. It was past midnight when I heard the front door. Not gentle, not measured. A heavy, stumbling weight against wood, followed by voices raised in urgent, clipped tones I didn't understand. I crept to my door and opened it just enough to see down the hallway, and what I saw stopped my breath entirely. Hae-un Choi was leaning against the wall near the entrance, one hand pressed to his side, dark red blooming through his shirt and spreading down to soak the waistband of his pants. His face had gone the color of ash. A man I didn't recognize was half carrying him, shouting something towards the back of the house, and for the first time since the auction, I saw the truth beneath the quiet, careful mask Hae-un Choi had worn since the moment he bought me. The monster everyone feared was bleeding out in his own foyer. I should have gone back to my room. Every instinct telling me to survive said close the door, lock it, let the monster bleed if that's what monsters do. But I'd spent 3 years learning how to read danger in a kitchen, how to patch a wound when there was no money for a hospital. And some part of me, the part that still remembered my father teaching me to keep a level head when everything was falling apart, refused to just stand there and watch. "He needs a doctor," the man holding him up was saying, his accent thick with panic. "Boss, I'm calling someone." "No." Hae-un's voice came out rough, but the command in it hadn't weakened at all, even half collapsed against a wall, with blood soaking through his shirt. "No doctors, not tonight." I stepped into the hallway before I'd fully decided to. "Where's a medical kit?" Both men turned. The one holding Hae-un upright looked at me like I'd grown a second head. Hae-un's eyes, glassy with pain, found mine and held there for a long, assessing moment, like even bleeding out he couldn't help cataloguing me as a variable he hadn't accounted for. "Bathroom," the man finally said. "Under the sink. I found it fast. Fully stocked. Military grade. The kind of kit that told me everything about the life this man actually led behind the glass walls and quiet staff." I came back to find Hae-un on a bench near the door, jaw locked against the pane, watching me with an unreadable expression as I snapped on a pair of gloves. "You don't have to do this," he said. "You're ruining the floor," I told him, and something in his face shifted. Not quite a smile, but close to one. I cut away the ruined fabric of his shirt and got my first real look at the damage. A long, jagged cut along his ribs, deep but not life-threatening if it was cleaned properly. Not a bullet. A blade. "My father was sick for a long time before he passed," I said, threading the suture needle. "I learned how to patch things up when we couldn't afford the ER." He didn't ask how I'd ended up at the auction with that kind of practical, hard-won competence. He just watched me work, his breathing ragged, his hand occasionally flexing against the bench like he was fighting the urge to stop me. When I finished, he sat there in silence for a long moment, looking at the neat row of stitches like he wasn't quite sure what to make of either the wound or the woman who'd closed it. "Most people," he said finally, "would have run." "I figured a dead criminal makes for a complicated week," I said. "I'd rather not find out." That earned the closest thing to a real laugh I'd heard from him, cut short by a wince as it pulled at his stitches. The days that followed fell into something I never expected. A strange, careful rhythm. Hae-un was rarely loud, rarely cruel. He spent most mornings in his office with the door cracked open, a tablet in one hand and a cup of black coffee he never seemed to finish. The staff treated him with a respect that bordered on reverence, the kind you couldn't buy or force. Mrs. Park softened whenever he walked into a room. The guards at the perimeter straightened without being told to. Whatever he was to his enemies, the people who worked for him saw something different. I started learning pieces of his world almost by accident. A name dropped in a phone call he forgot I could hear from the next room. A folder left open on his desk, full of shipping manifests and numbers that didn't add up the way numbers should. I'd spent years managing Sloane's debts on a diner waitress's salary, stretching impossible math into something survivable, and the patterns in Hae-un's paperwork looked uncomfortably familiar. Sloppy bookkeeping, money disappearing into accounts that didn't reconcile. "Your books are a mess," I told him one evening, the first time I worked up the nerve to say it out loud. He looked up from his desk, something sharp flickering behind his eyes. "And you'd know that how? I did the books for the diner where I worked, and I managed every dollar Sloane owed for years before she sold me to cover it." The words came out flatter than I expected. All the old shame burned away somewhere between the auction and this office. "I know how to make numbers behave." He studied me for a long moment, the kind of look that made me feel like he was recalculating something. "You understand what you'd be looking at if I let you near this." "I understand I'm tired of being someone's liability," I said. "Let me be useful instead." He pushed a stack of folders across the desk without another word. It was in those quiet hours, hunched over his ledgers with the rest of the house gone still around us, that I started to understand the shape of the danger Sloane's debt had actually connected me to. Hae-un wasn't simply a man with money and a temper. He ran something vast, something with shipping routes and shell companies and a level of precision that made the chaos in his books even stranger. Someone close to him had access to information they shouldn't have had. Someone had been bleeding the organization slowly, quietly, in ways small enough to miss unless you were looking as closely as I was. I found the first irregularity on a Thursday, a payment routed through an account that shouldn't have existed, signed off by someone inside his own circle. I didn't know yet whose name belonged to that signature. I didn't know that the moment I flagged it, I'd stop being simply the woman Hae-un Choi had bought at an auction, and become something far more dangerous, a threat to whoever inside his organization had decided his enemies were worth more than his loyalty. I didn't know it yet, but somewhere in the city, someone had already learned my name. And they were no longer interested in just hurting Hae-un Choi. They wanted to know who the woman keeping his books actually was. The attack came on a morning that started like any other. I was pulling a sweater over my head when the first explosion of sound tore through the house. Not gunfire yet, just the deep, splintering crack of the front doors giving way to something built to break them. For half a second, my brain refused to process it as violence. Then the house alarm dropped into a low, pulsing warning tone, and gunfire followed, chaotic and deafening, tearing through the hallway outside my room. "Stacy!" Hae-un's voice cut through the noise, raw in a way I'd never heard from him. My door flew open before I could reach it myself, and he filled the frame in tactical gear I didn't know he owned, a rifle gripped tight in both hands, blood already smeared across one cheekbone. "Get up, now!" I scrambled to my feet, my legs barely cooperating. "What's happening?" Someone sold our security frequency. His jaw was tight, his eyes scanning the hallway behind him, even as he reached for my arm. "We have minutes before they breach the inner doors. Move!" The hallway was choked with smoke, acrid and burning, and I kept my eyes mostly shut as he half dragged me toward the east wing, the one part of the house I'd never been allowed near. He fired twice down a stairwell without slowing, and I didn't look to see what he was shooting at. I just kept my feet moving and my hand locked around the back of his jacket. We hit a reinforced door at the end of the corridor. He slammed his palm against the biometric scanner. Access denied. He hit it again. Same result. A short, vicious curse left him as he understood what I was already starting to suspect. "They've cut the local network. Someone's locking us out from the inside." My mind, somewhere underneath the terror, started doing the thing it always did under pressure. Sorting, calculating, looking for the shape of the problem instead of just the danger of it. "Where's the physical server room?" He looked at me like I'd asked something insane in the middle of a firefight. "Basement." "Why?" "Because whoever's doing this is running it through the same network I've been auditing for 2 weeks, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "If we get to the hardware, I can bypass it manually. I found the back door 3 days ago." He didn't waste time arguing. He grabbed my hand, laced his fingers through mine like an anchor, and we ran. The basement smelled like concrete, and the metallic hum of server racks straining under load. He shoved me into the glass-walled server room and turned his back to the door immediately, gun raised, covering the only way in while I dropped into the chair at the main terminal. My hands were shaking, dust and adrenaline making my fingers clumsy on the keys, but the moment muscle memory took over, the shaking stopped. 2 minutes, he said behind me, his breath ragged. Blood was seeping through his shirt again, the same stitches, freshly torn. I bypassed the front-end login and dropped into the command line, punching in the strings I'd used to trace the irregular accounts in his books. Whoever had set up this breach had reused the same encryption pattern I'd already cracked once before. Arrogance, the same kind that had let me catch the discrepancy in the first place. "They're on the stairs," Hae-un said, voice flat with focus, the sound of a fresh magazine clicking into place behind me. I found the directory controlling the bunker lock, and then I found something else. A live transfer protocol, draining funds out of the organization's primary accounts in real time, routing toward an account I didn't recognize. "They're not just locking us out," I said. "They're stripping the accounts. Everything. Payroll, logistics, all of it. Let it go." Hae-un said, not turning, "Open the door." But if whoever was doing this succeeded, it wouldn't matter if we survived the next 5 minutes. An empire with no money couldn't hold itself together for a week. I thought of the auction floor, of Sloane's hand shoving me toward a stage, of every moment in my life someone else had decided what I was worth. I wasn't going back to being worth nothing. I opened a second window. I didn't try to stop the transfer. That would trip whatever failsafe the mole had built in. Instead, I redirected it, pasting in the routing number for an account I'd quietly set up days earlier while auditing his books, one with a single signatory, me. The progress bar resumed, 60%, 80, gunfire, erupted in the hallway outside. Hae-un fired twice. A body hit the floor. I didn't flinch. I finished the redirect, then pulled up the bunker's lock protocol and typed the override. The vault door at the end of the corridor groaned open. "It's open!" I screamed, grabbing the data drive from the terminal and shoving it into my pocket as Hae-un hauled me out of the chair and toward the door. We dove through as the steel slammed shut behind us, sealing out the gunfire, the smoke, the entire war happening above our heads. In the silence of the bunker, lit only by emergency yellow light, Hae-un slid down against the wall, blood soaking through his shirt again. I crawled to him with the medical kit bolted near the cots, and he caught my wrist before I could open it. "You stopped the drain," he said, studying me like he was seeing something for the first time. "Or, you didn't stop it." "I redirected it," I said. "It's safe. $68 million, untouched, in an account only I control." He didn't look angry. He looked at me the way you look at a storm you've just realized you respect more than fear. "You could have taken it and disappeared. No one would have found you." I thought about it, I admitted, and it was the truest thing I'd said since the night of the auction. But running is for people who still think of themselves as prey. I'm done being that. His hand found the back of my neck, pulling me close enough that our foreheads touched, his breath uneven against my mouth. "You're not prey, Stacy," he murmured. "You never were." When he kissed me, it tasted like blood and adrenaline and something neither of us had a name for yet. It wasn't gentle. It wasn't supposed to be. It was the first time in 3 years I'd been touched like I was something worth keeping instead of something to be used up. It took weeks for the house to stop smelling like smoke, for the bullet holes to be patched, for the names of the men responsible to disappear quietly and permanently from anyone's concern. Hae-un didn't tell me the details, and I didn't ask. I'd learned enough about his world to know some answers were better left in the dark. Months passed. The empire stabilized, stronger and leaner under the systems I'd rebuilt from the inside out. I stood at his side, in meetings I once would have been too invisible to attend. I stopped flinching at raised voices. I stopped sleeping with my back to the wall. And then, on an ordinary Tuesday morning, a car pulled through the gate that hadn't been cleared by anyone on the approved list. Sloane Whitlock stepped out of it, and she did not look like a woman who'd come to apologize. I watched her from the upstairs window before she ever saw me. Sloane Whitlock, standing at the edge of the gravel drive in a coat that used to be expensive and now just looked tired. The way she looked tired, the way everything about her had collapsed inward since the last time I'd seen her. It had been 8 months. 8 months since the auction floor, since the paddle, since the gavel that turned me from a daughter into a transaction. 8 months that had changed everything about who I was. I wasn't the same woman Sloane had shoved toward that platform. I ran the financial backbone of one of the most powerful organizations on the West Coast now. I'd rebuilt systems that had been hemorrhaging money for years, untangled webs of shell companies and offshore accounts until they ran clean and silent and entirely under my control. The men who used to look at me like I was decoration at Hae-un's side now waited for my approval before moving a single shipment. I'd earned that. Every late night, every line of code, every moment I'd sat across from a man everyone feared and refused to flinch had earned that. Mrs. Park found me at the window. "She's asking for you," she said carefully. "Should I have her removed?" I thought about it. Part of me, the part still healing from years of being made small, wanted exactly that. Wanted Sloane dragged off the property and never allowed near me again. But another part, colder and more deliberate, the part Hae-un had helped me find buried under all that old fear, wanted to see her face when she understood what she'd actually done the night she sold me. "No," I said. "Let her wait in the front room." She looked smaller up close. The designer clothes were gone, replaced by something cheap and ill-fitting. Her hands trembled around the strap of her bag, and when she saw me walk in, calm, composed, dressed in the kind of tailored clothing that used to belong to a different version of my life, something cracked across her face. Relief, maybe, or recognition that the girl she'd sold no longer existed. Stacy. Her voice broke on my name. "Oh my God, look at you. You look incredible. What do you want, Sloane?" "I need help." The words tumbled out fast, rehearsed, the same desperate cadence I remembered from every late-night phone call she used to take in the bathroom with the fan running. "The men I owed before, they're not the only ones anymore. I made some bad decisions after you." She caught herself. The word left dying before it could fully form, because we both knew that wasn't what had happened. "After everything, I owe people now who don't forgive debts. They're talking about hurting me, Stacy. You have to talk to him, Hae-un. He'll listen to you." I let the silence sit there for a long moment, watching her unravel under the weight of it. "You sold me," I said finally, "for $80,000. You stood in that room and let a stranger raise a paddle for me like I was inventory, and you didn't even look back when they walked me out the door." "I was desperate," she said, tears starting now, the same performance I'd watched her give 100 times over the years, except this time it didn't land anywhere near the place it used to. "I didn't have a choice. You don't understand what they would have done to me. I understand exactly what it feels like," I said quietly. "You taught me." She reached for my hands, and I let her take them only long enough to feel how steady mine were compared to hers. "Please. I kept a roof over your head for years. I raised you. You owe me, Stacy." I thought about every paycheck she'd taken, every friend she'd cost me, every night I went to bed exhausted and unseen so she could disappear into a card room and lose money we never had. I thought about the auction floor, the paddle, the cold certainty in her eyes when she'd handed me over like settling a bar tab. "I don't owe you anything," I said. "You made sure of that the night you sold me. You can't just—" Her composure broke entirely now, the tears turning ugly, desperate. "Stacy, please, they'll kill me. You're with the most powerful man in the city. One phone call, that's all I'm asking." I looked at her for a long time, waiting to feel the old pull, the guilt, the obligation, the lifetime of conditioning that told me to fix things for her, no matter what it cost me. It didn't come. There was only a quiet, settled certainty where that old reflex used to live. "I'm not a charity, Sloane," I said, "and I don't pay off bad debts that aren't mine." I walked to the door and asked one of the staff to see her out. She screamed after me, my name, accusations, the same desperate manipulations she'd used my entire life to bend me into whatever shape was useful to her. None of it touched me. I didn't look back, the way she hadn't looked back at me the night of the auction. Hae-un was waiting in the hallway when I stepped out. Arms crossed, his expression unreadable in the way it always was when he was deciding whether to interfere with something that was mine to handle. He hadn't said a word the entire time. He didn't need to. This had never been his fight to finish. "You didn't help her," he said. Not a question. "No." "How do you feel?" I considered the question honestly, surprised by how true the answer was. "Free," I said. He studied me for a moment, something like quiet pride settling into the line of his shoulders, and reached for my hand. "Good," he said, "because we have a problem that actually requires your attention." Across the city, in rooms I would never see, a rival organization had spent the last 3 weeks watching everything Sloane's desperate begging had just confirmed for them. That Hae-un Choi had a weakness now, a woman who managed his empire and meant more to him than any account number ever had. And they had decided that made me a target worth far more than $80,000. The attack came 3 nights after Sloane drove away from the estate, screaming threats that turned out to be the last useful thing she ever did for me. Because the desperation in her voice, the names she'd dropped trying to scare me into helping her, had reached exactly the people Hae-un's enemies needed to confirm what they'd suspected for months. I was reviewing shipping manifests in the office when the perimeter alarms tripped. Not the chaotic blaring of the first attack, but something colder, more coordinated. A series of measured pulses that meant whoever was coming this time had studied our defenses and built a plan around them. Hae-un was already moving before I'd fully processed the sound, pulling a sidearm from the drawer of his desk with the same economy of motion I'd come to recognize as the truest version of him, not the quiet man who drank coffee in silence each morning, but the one who'd built an empire out of nothing and intended to keep it. "Stay behind me," he said. And for the first time since the server room, I didn't argue, because I understood this fight wasn't going to be won with a keyboard. They came through the east gate first, the same vulnerability I'd helped patch months earlier, now exploited by someone who'd had inside knowledge of exactly where to look. Hayes met them at the perimeter with the rest of the guard, and the night dissolved into gunfire and shouting, and the particular chaos of 2 organized forces colliding in the dark. I'd learned enough in the months since the first attack to be useful in ways that didn't involve a weapon. I pulled up the building's internal cameras on a tablet, tracking movement through the grounds, calling out positions to Hae-un through the comm unit clipped to his vest. 2 men flanking the west wall, 3 more by the garage. "Copy," he said, already moving, already changing the shape of the fight based on information only I could give him. It was Dante's old contact, a man named Soo-jin, one of Dante's former associates who'd slipped through the cleanup after the first betrayal, who'd organized this attack, feeding information to a rival syndicate eager to carve out territory, while Hae-un was distracted. I found his name buried in a compromised account an hour into the fight, the same arrogant reuse of old passwords that had undone every traitor who'd ever underestimated how closely I read the numbers. "Soo-jin's running point from a van outside the south gate," I said into the comm. "He's coordinating everything. Cut him off and the rest of them lose direction." Hae-un didn't hesitate. I watched on the camera feed as he moved through the grounds with brutal efficiency, the fight collapsing inward toward the south gate exactly where I'd directed him. When it was over, when the gunfire finally stopped, and the only sound left was the wind off the coastline and the distant wail of sirens that would be paid to forget this night had happened, Hae-un walked back into the house with blood on his hands that wasn't his own, and the particular stillness of a man who had just secured everything he'd built. Soo-jin didn't survive the night, neither did the question of whether I belonged at Hae-un's side, because by morning, every capo and soldier in his organization knew exactly whose intelligence had won that fight. He called them together 2 days later, the same dining room where I'd once watched him slam a man's chest into the table for questioning my worth. This time he stood at the head of the table with my hand in his, in front of every person who answered to him. "What happened 3 nights ago?" he said, his voice carrying the absolute authority that had built his empire, "happened because someone underestimated this organization. They won't make that mistake again, because they're not dealing with 1 threat anymore. They're dealing with 2. His eyes swept the room, daring anyone to disagree. "Stacy isn't a guest in this house. She isn't collateral. She runs as much of this as I do, and her word carries the same weight as mine. Anyone who has a problem with that can leave tonight." No one left. I stood there in front of men who once would have looked through me, and felt something settle into place that had been missing since the morning my father died. Not safety exactly, but certainty. A place that was mine. earned rather than given, built out of every late night and every line of code, and every moment I'd refused to disappear. Later, on the catwalk above the warehouse, where I'd once watched shipments move beneath me like a current I was slowly learning to direct, Hae-un found me with 2 cups of coffee and the particular quiet that settled over him when the chaos had finally cleared. "The accounts are secure," I told him. "Insulated, untraceable. We're stronger than we were before the attack." "I know," he said. "I wasn't asking about the accounts." He set the coffee down and reached for me instead, his hand finding the curve of my jaw the way it had that first night in the kitchen, except now there was nothing uncertain in it, nothing tentative. Just the steady weight of a man who had decided, completely and without apology, that I belonged exactly where I was standing. "You're not what anyone expected, Stacy Brooks," he murmured. "Neither are you," I said. The woman Sloane Whitlock auctioned away had died long ago. Standing beside the most feared man in Korea, I finally understood something. Monsters don't always destroy you. Sometimes they teach you how to stop being prey.
Stacy Brooks walked into that auction hall with $400 and no one in her corner. She walked out of it as a woman running an empire. If you believe she earned every single thing she built, if you stand with Stacy and Hae-un Choi, drop a comment below and tell us, was the monster really the monster? Or was he the only one who ever saw her clearly? And if this story moved you the way we believe it did, hit that subscribe button right now and join the Juna AfroKorean Stories family. New stories drop every week, each one deeper, more emotional, and more powerful than the last. We will see you in the next one.